So this right here is my completed painting for this week's airbrush painting tutorial. And like always, I'm going to show you every single technique that I used to paint this one. We'll be starting this one by painting in the eyes and then working our way down the major structures of the portrait like the nose, the mouth, and the cheeks. And I'll finish up this little series by showing you how I painted this hair to make it look natural looking. So that's what we're going to be doing. If you want to paint this one along with me, up on the screen now is my completed painting. So please feel free to use this as your reference if you want to paint along with me. I've also included a gridded version if you want to use that to transfer over your lines or your contours. For this painting, I'm using Schmincke Aero colors and I'm only using two paints, black and white. I mixed up 3 separate values of this paint just like I did for that black and white eye tutorial from a few weeks back. And because there's white in all 3 of these mixtures, they're going to be considered an opaque paint or technically a semi-opaque paint. But just like transparent colors, I will still be controlling my values by how much paint I spray. The white in the mixture is going to be used to prevent these values from getting too dark too quickly. I'll also be using some pure white opaque paint right from the bottle to add this cooler secondary light source on the left side of the portrait, just to add some more interest to the painting. So let's get right into this one. The first thing I'm doing here is using a circle template to find one that fits the pupil close enough to my initial drawing. I'm using my darkest gray mixture and I didn't reduce these paints at all. I'm using these inks directly from the bottle. You can see that I just lightly sprayed that in. I didn't spray it at 100%, and what I'm doing here is switching to a larger circle. When I find a circle that fits close enough, I line it up with the edge of the iris and then just lightly spray in some more of this paint, just where the limbo ring is going to be on some people. And then I'll use another part of this circle, line it up with the left side of the iris and do the same thing. You can see that when I'm doing this, I'm just trying to direct the paint where that iris is. I'm trying not to let overspray get up onto the upper eyelid or the lower eyelid. But if a little bit of overspray gets onto that eyelid, it's no big deal. You could just clean it up with an eraser. A few months ago, when I was reordering some art supplies, I decided to pick up a few of these shields from Art Tool. The one you're seeing here is a very commonly used one. I used to have one of these years ago. This is called the Big Shield. It has a lot of different curves on it, so I found one here that fits the top part of the iris close enough where it separates between the iris and the upper eyelid. And then just like before, I sprayed some of that gray paint below. So you can see what I'm doing here with all these different shields. I'm basically just forming the boundaries within the iris. As I spray in this transition point between the lower eyelid and the iris, I'm going to extend it a little bit and just spray some of this paint over to the left side of the sclera, just to help darken it and set that boundary in between the sclera and the lower eyelid. Now there's going to be this very tiny specular highlight right in the center of the pupil, so I'm just erasing out a small amount of paint right now, just so I have that place marked in. And then I'll continue with this eraser, just working outside of the iris just to clean up a few mistakes. The surface that I'm painting on here is a smooth canvas that I set up myself. That's my favorite surface to work on. It gives me the control that I really like. And because I'm using a new paint for this one, I set this one up a little bit smoother, sanding it to like 400, 600 grit. And I had 0 issues erasing this Schmincke acrylic ink. I was very, very impressed with how it worked. So now within the iris, there's always going to be a bunch of textures. I've talked about this a bunch of times on the channel. So what I'm doing here is I'm just painting in some of these freehand. Wherever I see some shadows, I'm just kind of spraying them in. I added a little bit more paint on the top here where the upper eyelid and the eyelashes are casting a shadow on the iris itself. And then right back over to that circle template just to dust on some more of this dark gray on the left side of the iris to help darken it up. This eye is going to need to be a lot darker later on. So you can see what I'm doing here. I'm just slowly approaching that dark value, just slowly building up the paint. If a few of the textures that I painted in freehand got too dark, I could just clean them up like I'm doing now with an eraser. Now on the upper right hand side of the iris is going to be a specular highlight reflecting the light. And so the tool that I'm using to erase out all of this paint is an electric eraser. This is a Sumo Grip. And instead of the white erasers that it comes with, I'm using the ones that I've always been using on this channel. That's the Seed Erasers. It's a Japanese company called Sundolphin, and they make these extremely aggressive sand eraser nibs that fit into most electric erasers. And now from here, I'm going to go right back over to that shield and just spray in that transition point between the lower eyelid and the iris itself. And then I'll continue freehand, just dusting on some of this gray paint into the iris right over the pupil just to help darken it up. And so not only does that paint darken up the iris, but it also gives me something to erase into. So I'm going to switch over to my ink eraser here. This is a Faber-Castell ink eraser, the 7058B, and I'm just erasing out a few of the highlights that I see within the reference. Remember that most of the textures within the eye are always going to radiate from the center of the pupil right out to the edge of the iris. And now that's not a rule 100% of the time, but most of the time that's what you're going to see. I'll switch back over to my electric eraser and just rework into the specular highlights, really remove all that paint to make them pure white. And now once everything is in place, I want to start darkening things up. The first thing I'm going to do is use that same color, the number 3 gray mixture, and just use a shield to just help spray in some parts of the iris here to help darken everything up. And so here everything is pretty much in place. So what it's time to do is start really building up the contrast. So I'm going to switch over to the color black. Now for this color, I'm using it directly from that dropper bottle right into my airbrush, and I'm going to start here with the pupil. I want the edges of the pupil defined, but I don't want them too sharp, so I'm going to use a little trick here. I started with the smallest circle, sprayed it at 100%, and then I'm moving up to different size diameter circles. As I move up to larger circles, I just spray a little bit less, and you can see what we get here. We still get a defined edge, but it's not too sharp. And that's a simple trick that I use a lot of the time when I'm using shields. Sometimes I'll just spray one part of the shield, then move it a little bit, spray a bit more. That way you still get that defined edge, but it's not razor sharp. For the top part of this iris, which is in a shadow, I'm going back to this same shield, and you can see I'm just kind of moving it around, finding one part of this curve that fits that upper eyelid transition. And then I'll start spraying in this black paint, trying to add a gradient here, spraying a little bit more of this paint toward the top and letting the overspray just kind of dust down below to get that transition. And now because I added that black paint, it's obviously going to darken up that highlight. So I'll come back in with my electric eraser, clean it back up, and then I'll go right back over to that black paint with the shields and just darken up the edges of the iris. Once some more of this paint is down, I'll go right back over to that stick eraser and just add some more of the detail within the iris itself. And you can see what I'm doing here, right? It's just layer after layer. The next thing I want to do here is add some value into the whites of the eyes. So what I'm using here is my lightest gray mixture. I'll find a shield that fits that lower eyelid close enough, and then I'll just spray on the smallest amount of this paint. Just a light dusting to help get rid of some of that white gesso. I'll do the same thing for the upper eyelid, and then over to the right where the tear duct is, I'll just use a little bit more paint. You can see it's the same color, it's an opaque paint, but I'm still controlling my values by how much paint I spray. And from here, what I want to start doing is adding in these eyelashes. So the first thing I'm doing is just spraying a small amount of this paint on the lower part of that upper eyelid. This is going to be a much darker value later on where the eyelashes all come together, so I just want to get some color in there now to get it started. And now for these eyelashes, I'm starting out by drawing them in with a 2B graphite pencil. The nice thing about graphite in a black and white drawing like this is that it's just so easy to erase. If any of these are incorrect or I drew them just maybe in a wrong angle or something, I could just erase them out with a normal eraser and redo them. I'm going back to that light gray mixture and just using a shield here to paint in the lower part of the tear duct. Basically just getting some value in there and then using an eraser to erase out the two highlights here. I'll come in later and add some more detail, but for now, just get it in place. For the rest of the eyelashes, I'm going right back to that 2B graphite pencil, and you can see at some points I'm using a shield just to help draw them in sharp and defined. But for the majority of these, I could just draw them in freehand. It's just about taking your time, not rushing, just slowly following your reference, following the curve of each eyelash. And now for this crease just above the upper eyelid where the eye rounds into the orbit, I'm going to use a shield with that light gray mixture. And you can see here that this shield does not fit this curve perfectly, but I move it around. And what I'm doing here is I'm spraying on the shield itself, just letting the overspray just kind of get onto the canvas so I get a very light, soft line. This is another part that's going to need to be darker later on, but you can see what I'm doing here. I'm always going light. That way, if something's a little bit off, which happens a lot of the times, I could just erase it. I could just clean it up with any eraser and do it again. So I'll finish up some of these eyelashes here, again, just drawing them in with that pencil. And then I'll use my airbrush with the number 2 gray mixture and just spray some value into the lower part of the eyelashes where they just kind of clump together. I'll also use some of this color and a shield just to spray some more paint on the left side of the eye to help darken it further. I noticed that there's a few very thin highlights in here, a few hairs that are catching some light. So before I go darker, I'm going to use my X-Acto blade just to scratch a few of these in. As I build up layers, adding more paint, most of these are going to get hidden away, but it's just going to be a very slight hint of some highlights in there. So just do it early before I add some of that darker paint later on. At this point, I think the eyelashes are good enough. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to darken them up, kind of set the final values for them. And what I'm using here is a colored pencil. It's a black colored pencil, and I'm just going right over these eyelash lines again. And so once I finish the eyelashes up, what I want to start doing here is putting the eye within the orbit itself. So we're going to need to add some shadows. I'm using my middle gray mixture, and again, even though this is an opaque or a semi-opaque color, I'm still controlling my values by how much paint I spray. I don't want to spray too much of this. If you look at my completed painting on the left side of the screen, you can see where these shadows are going to be within the orbit. So I'm using that light gray mixture to spray in some very light shadows just above the eye, below the frontal bone, which is basically just below the eyebrow. And as I'm doing this, I'm keeping some distance between my airbrush and the canvas to give a very smooth gradient. And just pay attention to where you see those values. The orbit where the eye sits is recessed within the skull. And making up that orbit is the frontal bone just above it where the forehead is. You have the small nasal bone over to the right where the nose is going to be. And then you have the zygomatic underneath. So you have all these areas that are just kind of protruding around the eye itself. So you can see what I'm doing here is just adding in some of the shadows that I see just below the frontal bone, basically just below the eyebrow. And then to bring out some of the highlights, I'm using an eraser here, and this time I'm using a softer eraser just so I don't add too much texture. Now, I personally love texture in all my paintings. It's always something that I'm trying to build up and add more of. But I do know that some of you want a smoother skin texture, so another way to do it without spraying an opaque color is to use a softer eraser. The eraser I'm using here is a 7056 by Faber-Castell. And what I'm doing is just very gently going over the areas that I want to be brighter. What this is going to do is remove some of the paint, but not all of it. So you're not going to get that large contrast between a dark value and a light value, like if you use a more aggressive eraser or an electric eraser. You can easily get a much softer highlight using a softer eraser, but you do need to take your time with this. This is something that can't be rushed. If you work very quickly and have a lot of areas of light and dark, it's going to look like texture. It's going to look like highlights and shadows. So the key to working with a softer eraser is just like any other one, is making sure that the eraser marks overlap to give you an even value. It's very similar, if not identical, to drawing, where there's a bunch of ways to add up value, hatching, cross-hatching, small circles. It's really the same thing with the eraser, except with the eraser, you're subtracting paint rather than adding it. And now before I add some more paint to start darkening up the orbit, what I want to do is add the eyebrow in. This is going to be the first layer, so not too much detail, just kind of getting everything in place. I'm using a pencil here. This is a 2B pencil, and I'm also using an X-Acto blade. The pencil obviously is to draw in the darker hairs, where the X-Acto blade is used to pull out the thin highlights, the small hairs that are just catching some light. Once I get some of those in, I'm going to switch over to my darkest gray mixture, spray some of this paint over the eyebrows to just darken them up, and then I'll continue with this mixture into that area just below the eyebrow to darken up some of those shadows. You can see mainly it's on the left side and on the right side toward the nasal bone. And you'll see me just kind of reworking into some parts of the eyes where it needs to be darker, some of the creases, and within the eye itself, the pupil and the iris. And then once those areas are darkened up, I'm going right back over to my eraser. You'll see me using both here, the softer eraser and the harder one. I'm using the softer eraser for the larger areas of highlights, the highlights that I want to look a little bit softer. And then I'll use that harder eraser, that 7058B, just to pull out some of the areas that I want to be a little bit sharper and brighter. And with that eraser, I'd say that's good enough for now. So what I want to do is move on to the next part, adding in that lower eyelid. Now there's going to be a highlight on the upper part of this lower eyelid. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a shield and just place it below that highlight. I'm using my number 2 gray mixture, and again, I'm not spraying it at 100%, just dusting it on, just trying to get that transition point between the highlight and the shadow. And then once I get that transition point in, I'll switch over to the airbrush freehand and just add some of this paint on top to darken up the whole value. And you can see right here that even though this paint has that opacity to it with that white mixed in, if I spray it at such a light value, you could still see through it, so you could darken up areas. But I do need to be aware that since this paint is semi-opaque, if this lighter value gets on any of the black areas that I painted before, it's going to lighten them up. So that's something that I'm always aware of. What I'll do later on is just go back with some black paint just to help darken up some areas if they got a little bit too light. Now I'll go right back over to a pencil. I'm using a lighter one here. This is a 2H. It's a harder pencil, just to sketch in a few of the eyelashes on the lower eyelid. For some of those eyelashes that are catching some light, I'll use an X-Acto blade and scratch them out. And you can see right here that I made a mistake. I accidentally pulled out too much paint for this eyelash on the upper eyelid. So what I'll do is I'll use some black paint and just glaze it over the top to darken it back up. I'm also using some of this transparent black paint just around some parts in the eye that need to be a little bit darker, spraying the smallest amount. And then it's just going back to what I'm always doing, just basically drawing with the eraser, trying to brighten up some areas that may seem too dark, and then of course using the airbrush to darken some areas that seem too light. And now we have the eye and the majority of the orbit in place. It still needs plenty of work, but we got it down, so I'm going to move on to the next part. I'm using a freehand shield with my lightest value to line up between this transition on the nose, right between the ala, the small little highlight there, the wing on the left side of the nose, and then the cast shadow off to the left. Once I have that in, I have my reference point, so what I'll do is I'll start spraying in some of this value up the sidewall of the nose. I'll just start from the top, work my way down. I want it very soft, so you can't even see my airbrush in frame here. I'm holding it like 6 to 7 inches back from the canvas. And if some of the overspray got into some of the areas that I worked for in the eye, I'll just clean them up with that soft eraser again. Now with this light gray mixture, I want to start getting in this cheekbone, the zygomatic bone right below the eye, right below the orbit. I'm starting on the left side where we have this really dark shadow. This image itself is going to have very high contrast. The brights are going to be very light. Some of the shadows are going to be very dark. But even though this value is going to need to be much darker later on, I'm still working slowly, just building up with my lightest gray. I'll move to my second one later on, and eventually I'll use the third darkest one, just slowly building up to that dark value. And again, you can't even see my airbrush when I'm painting this in. It's like 7-8 inches back, but you can see right here in this area that I'm pointing out that I was able to paint in that transition point between the highlight and that dark shadow. Of course, it's very subtle at this point. It's barely even noticeable, but that's good because I can darken it up later on. I just want to make sure I get it in the right place. And now from here, I want to start darkening everything up. So I'm going to switch over to that next darker mixture, the number 2 gray mixture. And I'll start by working my way around the eye, just adding a little bit more of this paint to get it a bit darker. And then I'll add some more of this paint down the left side of the face where I'm seeing that dark shadow. I'll use a freehand shield to get in that jawline, that separation of the mandible from the neck just below it. Just spray some of that paint in so I have that sharper line. And then I'll just continue with this paint, working my way up the left side of the face, building it up, getting it a little bit darker. Now I have this video sped up just because I think it's easier to get a sense of what I'm doing that way. But please keep in mind that I'm actually doing this very slowly. I'm just spraying a small amount of paint, keeping some distance from my airbrush to the canvas, and then just looking at it, observing, trying to see what needs to be fixed, what needs to be darker or lighter. And then to soften up some of these transitions and bring up some highlights, I'm going right back over to my soft eraser. And with the eraser, it's all about drawing, working slowly, paying attention to your reference, trying to notice where you see highlights and the textures within them. I'll switch over to my darkest gray mixture and I'll use this to work around some of the eyes. You can see when I spray this in, it's almost black. It's a very, very dark gray. And I'll also be using my colored pencil and my graphite pencil just to clean up and sharpen up some of the eyelashes. I'll use this darker gray mixture to start on the right side, work my way around into these shadows, adding some more paint to darken them up. And in order to get those softer transitions, it's all about distance and patience. Make sure you're taking your time and you're not holding your airbrush too close to the canvas. And then of course, a little bit of cleaning up with the eraser, call that part done, and I'll move on to the right eye. For the right eye, it's the exact same thing. The only difference here is I started with the eyelashes. They were very dark and defined, so I wanted to get them in place first before working on the rest of the eye. But everything that I'm doing here on the right eye is really exactly the same thing I did on the left eye, just paying attention to my reference, starting with lighter values first, slowly building up to the darker values. And of course, plenty of use with the eraser to clean up any overspray, some areas that got a little bit too messy, and to add in some of the highlights. And you'll see here as I move up to the eyebrow, I'm using the exact same techniques that I used for the left eyebrow. I'm drawing them in first with a graphite pencil, like an HB or a 2B, one a little bit darker. And then I'll come back in with the airbrush. I'm using the number 2 gray mixture here and just spraying some of the shadows that I see within the orbit. A bit of cleaning up with the eraser and then spraying a little bit more of this paint over the top in some areas that need to be a bit darker. Now that most of this eye is in place, I'm going to switch back to the black colored pencil. And I'm just using this sparingly on the left side of this right eyebrow just to add a few of the darker hairs in. And then I'll use the airbrush with some black paint and just add in a few of the shadows that I see within the hairs of this eyebrow. There's also going to be some very subtle highlights in here, so I'm going to use the X-Acto blade and just scratch out a few lines. And as I'm scratching a few of these lines out, I'm just doing it in the direction that the darker hairs are. They're all kind of moving in this one from the left over to the right. A few of the eyelashes on this upper eyelid are just catching a very subtle amount of light. So what I'm doing here is just drawing in some of the darker ones with a pencil, but for some of the ones that are catching highlights, I'm just going to lightly scratch them in, just kind of give the impression of them. And so now we have both eyes in place. So to finish up the first part of this tutorial, what we're going to do is just paint in the nose. This one is going to be nice and easy. If you look at my completed painting on the left side of the screen, you'll notice that the darkest part of this nose is at the bottom around the nostrils where it's casting a shadow. And so now, even though I want this area to be very dark, there are still going to be some very subtle highlights within this shadow. So what I'm going to do here is start with the number 3 gray mixture. That's my darkest gray mixture. And start with the darkest part, which are the nostrils. And then I'll use a part of a freehand shield that fits the curve of the nostril close enough, and then spray in some of this paint. And again, even though this area is going to need to be very dark, I sprayed in that first line, that first transition point, pretty lightly, just so I can kind of get it in place. And the reason for that is just to give myself some room for error. If the proportions are off or the angle was wrong, I could use an eraser to clean it up and just kind of adjust it. Or I could use a shield to spray in some more paint and kind of shape it the way I'd like. And you can see what I'm doing now with that dark gray mixture. I'm spraying it pretty heavily in here just to start adding in that dark value. In the camera here, it almost looks black, but it's not. There is some white in this mixture. And what I'm doing at the bottom here is just kind of dusting on a small amount of this paint below it just to get a gradient from the really dark color moving out to the white. With my freehand work there, the top edge got a little sloppy. It's not that sharp anymore, so I'll come back in with the shield to clean it up. I'll lay this over the nostril and then just move it up the smallest amount, like a 0.5 millimeter, and spray in some more of this paint. For this cast shadow right underneath the nose, I'm going to use my shield, and you'll just see me kind of moving it around here, getting it to fit that curve. I just spray small parts at a time, and if I do this slowly, I can get all those lines to connect. And then I'll go right back over to the airbrush freehand just to darken up some areas. For the right side of the nose, you'll see me kind of fumbling with this shield, trying to find one part of it that fits. And then when I find a part that fits close enough, I line it up and spray a little bit of paint into the columella. That's that bridge right between the two nostrils. And you can see that when I remove my shield, we just get some separation there between the nose, the columella, and the right nostril. I'll add in some paint freehand just below the nostril, and then what I want to do is get that transition point between the nose and the cast shadow off to the left. I use a shield, just sprayed a small amount of that paint, and then I go right back over to the airbrush freehand, just kind of glaze some of this paint over the top to help darken everything up. I'll look for another part of this shield that fits the right nostril. Doesn't fit perfectly, so you'll see me kind of moving it around again, just spraying small parts at a time. I found 2 parts of the curve that fit close enough. I sprayed them in and just kind of overlapped them to get an even transition. And then for the ala, just to the right of that nostril, I used another part of the shield and just dusted on some paint to the left. A lot of the highlights on the right side of the face are going to be very bright. It's almost oversaturated, so it's very important not to spray too much paint. So once I get those lines in, I'll go right back over to the airbrush freehand and spray in the rest of the nostril. This way I get that sharp line on top and a soft transition at the bottom. And now that everything is in place, I'll just continue with this paint, just doing it freehand, darkening up some of the values. For the cast shadow over to the left, I want to define the edges, so I'm using a shield again, just spraying small parts. And so now at this point, all the major parts of the nose are in place, so what I'm doing here is basically just adding some more paint to just help kind of sculpt it. Anywhere that I add some more paint to darken it up is going to look like a shadow rolling away from us. And of course, the brighter part, the highlight, is going to look closer to us. So that's the key to getting this illusion. Dark for the shadows, areas that are rounding away, and the brighter areas or the highlights are the areas that are sticking up, catching some of that light from the light source, which on this one is up and to the right. And so that's going to be it for this first part. We got both eyes in, and now we have the nose in. The only thing that I'm doing here is first coming in with that hard eraser to pull out that very bright highlight on the tip of the nose, and then switching over to the pink eraser, the softer one, just to pull out some more of the subtle highlights within the nose. So there you go. That's part 1 done. I hope you enjoyed this one. I hope you picked something up. And before I go, I do want to say thank you so much to all of you who watch this channel, subscribe to it, and like these videos. One thing that I love about this channel is just getting to connect with all of you each week and chatting with you in the comments section. Really, the pleasure is all mine, and I'm glad that these videos are helpful to some of you out there. Just keep on working, keep on painting, don't let others try to bring you down, and always stick to what you think is true and important with your art. And finally, thank you so much for the incredible, kind, and generous support of the current channel members. I'd like to welcome the newest members, Lynn and Kenneth. Thank you guys so much for joining. Welcome to the channel. I'd also like to welcome EDC, Taper, and Huey at generous tier 3s. That's really nice of you guys. Thank you so much. There's a new members video coming up this week, and of course I will include the reference photo and the grids up on the members page. So thanks again, guys. Be well. I'll see you next week.